I've been waiting all day for this. Baron, my handsome man. Hi, human. Hey, babe. You ready? All right, let's roll it.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure when we'll air this one, but welcome to Soul Sense. Today, I'm really excited because we have a guest on the show who has become a really prominent human being in my life and someone who I wouldn't have had the pleasure of meeting unless I had kind of jumped into going back to school this year. So I'm going to welcome Jeremy. Good morning, Jeremy.
Hi.
Good. Who is a peer of mine, a friend of mine, someone I look to for inspiration through my own recovery and my own journey and my own mental wellness. And the funny thing about Jeremy and I is that we grew up in the same town.
We did. Oh, man.
Isn't that strange that we just didn't know that until...
You know what? We probably actually ran into each other, but we just never knew. Ever.
Yeah, both just causing trouble in our own ways and, doing those things. What else did you do in Perth, besides get in trouble? So Jeremy and I are in the mental wellness and addiction program at St. Lawrence together, and we've finished our first year, which I'm so proud of us for doing. So how are you doing? How are you doing today?
Today I'm pretty good. We were talking, but there's some things in the world that are starting to go on, especially with the pandemic and with everything on the news right now in terms of what's going on in the States. Yesterday I was in a really good mood. Today I woke up kind of just saddened, that this is the world that we live in, and we have to go through these hard things, and we have to go and we have to feel them and we have to process them. So today's a little bit of I wouldn't say annoyed, but it's a little darker day, I guess, in terms of just, everything that's going on.
Will you take a moment for us, Jer, and just elaborate right now what it is that you're referring to that maybe has kind of thrown you a little bit today?
Yeah, I think we're all kind of obvious to what's going in the news in terms of what's going on with the death of George Floyd. And for me, someone of color, and anytime something of this nature comes up, it definitely affects me due to the fact that, I've experienced racism growing up. And I still deal with it. I think a lot of people like to say it's 2020 and, that's not really an issue, but it's always an issue and it's always going to be an issue. And especially when things like this come up in the news and we see live video of something that's very graphic and something that is really unhuman, it affects me. So it's hard to watch, and sometimes it's really hard to process.
Absolutely. And, you are one of millions of people, I think, who are sort of affected by the aftermath and what are we going to do and what does this mean?
Yeah.
And turning the spotlight on certain things. But you actually touched on something that I want to come back to that's a little more personal to you. And that is, we always have a guest appearance or guest star here. And that is, you mentioned growing up with racism and those kinds of things that you experienced. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that for me? Because as I said, we grew up in a very small town. And one of my realizations, having grown up in this small town, is that I was sort of unknowingly ignorant, and I can say that as I grew up as a straight white female in the small town of Perth that we grew up in, and there wasn't a lot for us to experience outside of my family situation or my school situation. So I didn't even know that these things existed almost, and so that's where I felt ignorant growing up. So my upbringing was much different than yours. So can you elaborate on that for me a little bit?
Yeah, and it's a little. I mean, it's a little different for me as opposed to, I grew up in an adopted family where I had white parents and a black brother. So my parents adopted two children of color, and then we grew up in a primarily white community and town, and a town that, there's all these, I guess, classifications of like a redneck society. And I'm still like, I'm doing with the bunny ears again. But yeah, growing up in where we grew up in Perth, and the surrounding areas and towns and communities around it, I don't think it was a completely obvious thing that racism was a problem. It was definitely something that was kind of pushed into the dark and pushed into the back alleys of our community. And I think a lot of people, I don't want to say tried to ignore it, but didn't really go out looking and seeing if it existed. As someone like me who, was exposed to it and saw it, I wouldn't say daily, but definitely often. So, I mean, it was hard, and I'm not the only one in my town who experienced it. I mean, me and my brother we grew up in the same household, and we went to the same schools, and we went through the same school system, and we were involved in the same sports organizations. And it's not to say that it just existed in schools. It existed in, the organized sports that we were involved in. And even, I would lose friends due to the fact that my friends were really okay with who I was, but their parents were, because, maybe their parents grew up at a different time and place and maybe weren't more open to accepting people of color. But definitely I saw it, and that I think that's what comes down to it. I saw it and I lived it and I experienced it. And maybe there's other places that it's more predominantly there than others, but yeah, definitely, at least where I grew up and what I experienced, it happened quite often. It happened in the slightest little ways, and it happened in the most obvious ways. There was people that made it sometimes their duty to be like, yeah, like, you're black and I'm going to make fun of that and I'm going to expose that. And then there are other people who kind of maybe, they would use their humor and their little jokes. But, when it came down to it, racism was racism. However you try to convey it, it is what it is. So it didn't really matter if it's small or if it's on a more larger scale. It happened. It's going to happen.
Still, yeah, and hurtful. And I was it something that you were aware of then at a young age growing up, or was it something like how did that impact you in wanting to be involved in those things and feeling like you belonged or being a part of those things? Like how did that impact you as a youth growing up? And then my next question is, did that contribute to any sort of aspects where you tried to escape? We've talked about that with drug use, with alcohol, with different things. Did one lead to another? Are those two things connected for you in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I knew about it at a really young age. Before I was really exposed to it, I mean, I don't think kids in kindergarten know what racism but growing up with the family, and I'm really lucky and I'm really privileged to have the mother and father that I grew up with and who adopted me, and they took like a really big interest in educating me before I got to that stage of life where they would think that I would run into certain these issues in life. So I was pretty well, I wouldn't say educated, but I was well informed that, you know, it existed and racism existed. Um, and then to grow up later in life and start to experience it, I still had no idea as to why it existed, but I knew that it did, and at least I was a little bit aware that this is something, and will continue to be something that I'll experience and that I will grow up with. And it's, for me, you know, everybody has their things that they have to grow up with and they have to be challenged with. Growing up as a young colored child in Lanark County, I knew that this would be something that I would always be exposed to. And in terms of how that affected me, I was always a happy kid. I'm a pretty happy person too, like now in my life. But there definitely was a time when growing up that racism was like, man, it really cut me down. It really kind of darkened my internal light, if you want to say, on how I looked at the world and in change, how that discrimination affected how I think of myself. You know, I was happy, and then I would start to experience these things, and I would start hearing the name calling and like I would encounter the physical racism of getting beat up and being called very derogatory names. And that definitely started to take a really big toll on me in terms of, you know, I didn't really want to put myself out there as me anymore. I wanted to kind of shy away and sit in the back and just kind of watch the world and watch things happen and try to just stay out of the way, because I didn't want to be in any kind of limelight. I didn't want to kind of be in any spotlight where people would see me, or they would say they would notice me, because I always felt that that's the first thing they would notice. They would notice that, hey, Jeremy's black, and you know, I wasn't comfortable with that. I wasn't comfortable. You know, I wasn't comfortable. There was a time where I wasn't comfortable going out in public, even with I was with my parents or my brother or other kids around my age that were of color. I still wasn't comfortable, even though I had these, and they were great people, and they would have had my back, and I know they had my back. But you know, being constantly exposed to such negative things like that, yeah, it does take a toll on me, and it did. So definitely, I think in my life where I've kind of turned that corner and seeing what it is, you know, and still being able to remember who I am and what amazing person that I am. I think it's still an issue sometimes with me in terms of, you know, when you hear certain things in songs and certain, you know, behavior in songs and music videos, and especially, yeah, it's still a thing with me, but it's a lot better. But it will always be a thing.
It'll always be something that's there for you. Do you think that when you were moving through those pieces where you kind of wanted to hide and pull back, that's sort of where the self-love, self-confidence maybe started to disappear for you, and then that left you a little bit more susceptible to some of the other, let's call them life choices that you and I made, and roads that we may have gone down? Do you think a part of that was a distraction or a numbing mechanism to what you were feeling from the external world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, racism was definitely something very serious in my life, and something that I tried to shy away with and tried to find some kind of coping mechanism to deal with. There was also other things in my life going on, but definitely the lack of self-confidence that I had started to develop because of it started to really affect me. And by it affecting me, I definitely started making some poor life choices. And, you know, I wouldn't call it poor life choices. I would say that they were just choices I made. You know, I started to definitely find myself in a dark place. And I was like, there's got to be something that I can do to numb these things. And unfortunately, I turned to drugs and alcohol instead of trying to find, I would say, I guess, more positive outlets to deal with it. But yeah, this definitely led me to something that kind of dragged me down for a number of years.
Right. It's funny because you reference it as choices, and I always say when I'm looking back at my past, everything to me was life research. I was just like doing research and then figuring out the outcomes, and as that came, what worked and what didn't. So there's a beautiful story that you have. So your story to me, through your addiction, all of the things that happened. I kind of want you to give us a little bit of the Cliff's Notes of what all of that is, because it actually is such a profound part of who you are that's brought you here to this place today, and to the person that you are, and the person I believe who is going to use every experience and choice that you've had to help other people. So can you give me a little bit of a rundown sort of on when addiction really happened to you, when it made its way into your life, and what these sort of moments were? Because I want to get to that moment that we also talked about in group one time, which was your remember when moment. So I just want you to maybe kind of take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, addiction for me kind of pretty much started, I would say, probably just before high school, definitely. And around that time, I was definitely experiencing things like we've talked about, like racism, discrimination. But there was a lot of other things going in my life. As I've mentioned, I have a brother, and he is also a recovering addict and alcoholic. And at that time was not in a good place, and that really affected our family. My mom was also very sick, and at the time we thought it was her in a really bad place in terms of health. But when I step back and I look at it now, she was dying. And my father was the pillar of our family and would do anything and everything to keep us on a good level in terms of how we felt, and tried to keep us happy. But, in the background, I was fading. I was definitely feeling all the pressures of, dealing with my mom, my best friend, being sick, essentially dying. My brother was a very violent alcoholic and a very violent addict at the time. And God bless his soul, he's found a way more better lifestyle now, and he's doing amazing, and I'm so proud of him. But as I said, I was also dealing with issues of abandonment through my adoption, racism, and it all started to boil up to this point where I couldn't handle it anymore. And coming into high school, you're definitely exposed to more maybe negative things in the background that I think we're all familiar with, drugs and pre-drinking and stuff like this. And I latched onto that, and I remember just being like, finally, something that is just, I'm carrying all this like balled up anger and emotion and depression inside and anxiety, and I can't figure out a way to process it. And then someone gives me this drink or this drug, and all of a sudden it evaporates, and finally left with just being able to be like, man, I can just finally breathe. And you
were anything like me, I was really good at drugs. I was really good at them.
Yeah, drugs were like the Olympics. Like, I'd win gold every day. Absolutely.
Yeah, all the time. It was just, you were just thinking them. I mean, in that moment, now we look back at it and we're like, ooh. Yeah, but I know, and at a young age, and then also, I just want to stop because you were introduced to drugs, I think, around the same time. I was 15. I was 15 years old, I think, the first time I put a line of cocaine up my nose or experimented with ecstasy or different things at a time where we weren't emotionally intelligent, where our brains were still developing. but this was the heightened moment that took us away from everything. So it was such a dangerous age for you to be playing with that as well.
Yeah, and like, I think you have to also think about this, that I think a lot of majority of, I won't speak on other people, there are definitely people in the world that, they get to like high school and they get to that age and they start seeing all these other things around them they've never been exposed to, and they start experimenting. We also have to take in consideration that, like, personally, and I'll speak for myself, I never like to speak about other people or speak on other people's stories, but for me personally, now that I look back on it, I was still developing. Like, me as a person, like, my brain was still developing. How I internalized emotions, that part of my growth was still developing. And then I throw in these drugs and these alcohol and all these things that are just dampening that growth. Fast forwards a couple years later, well, now I'm emotionally kind of stunted and I really don't know how to process things, as these other things in my life are getting worse and building up because I've ignored them. And now I'm at this point, 18, 19, where I'm like, I have no idea how to process anything, except that if I feel something, I'm taking this to make it go away.
Yep.
I think it's not really talked about sometimes, that we lose that emotional growth and that stuntness when we start experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and down the road that we see the consequences of that.
I actually, and I'll stop you there too, I noticed it the most, and I've actually asked my doctor quite a few times. I'm like, I would love to see a scan of like my brain, because I know that I was a very heavy drug user from the age of 15 to 21. And I know that there was damage done, I know that. And now at 37, when I, whether it's my memory, whether it's certain things that come up, I'm like, I wonder if that is an effect of the amount of drugs I used at such a young age. Because there are pieces of me, and I do really feel like that. I had no emotional capacity to learn how to process things. And then also because of the amount of drugs in my system, the only way that I would react was I would be super high, really happy, or shit was like ceiling to the floor, ceiling to the floor, ceiling to the floor. I didn't know how to function as a person. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's it. When you say that, I can just relate to it, because I'm very grateful for where I am, but I do know that, I set myself back a little bit in the choices that I made. But I also don't play a victim to my choices in my life. And even though I was at a very young age and maybe influential in all of those things, I still am very accepting of the choices that I did make in my life, and just learning how to move forward from those. What happened at 18 and 19? Where did it go from there?
18, 19, man, I guess I was still in Perth. I was still somewhat trying to keep it together and look towards what I wanted to do with my future, but in the background knowing that I probably wasn't going to achieve it, just due to the fact that I like doing drugs and alcohol a lot better, because that is what I'd known at the time. 18, 19, I got accepted actually into the last year of my high school, which was not a good one. I got involved actually in the school musical. Somehow someone convinced me to try out for the school musical. And anyway, so I tried it and I got this part. And it turned out like I really liked it actually. It was I got to like express myself, I guess, in a different way that other than drugs and alcohol. And I kind of was like, maybe this is good. And so after that, it all happened and the play was over and the last year of high school ended. I decided to apply to college in Brockville for their musical theater program. So I moved to Brockville for 3 years. And I mean, I was not a good student. I was still really heavily into drugs and alcohol, and I was still ignoring all these things in my life that definitely needed attention. But, I made it through 2.5 years of it, barely. but I was still heavily using both drugs and alcohol, pretty much anything I could get my hands on. And at that point, it had taken a serious toll in terms of physically and mentally, and my overall view of things was just totally distorted. And at the same time, my mom was getting exceptionally more ill, to the point where, we would get these calls where we'd have to rush to the hospital. And, every hospital visit, we didn't know if all right, maybe this is it. And unfortunately, we got one of those calls one time, and, that was it. And she passed, and, and then if I needed an excuse to completely submerge myself in a life full of drugs and alcohol, I definitely used that as my excuse to do it. I'm never saying that was the proper way of doing it, but that's what I did at the time. I don't regret it in terms of, some people might say I regret doing that. I mean, I don't regret it. I definitely think I could have done something more positive, but it definitely threw me off the deep end of my life at that point. And at that point, I really started to get kind of heavily involved in criminal aspect of that lifestyle, and being exposed to crimes that I was very okay with taking part in. In terms of, I would find myself, getting involved with really bad people and getting involved myself in crimes that would land me in jail. And eventually it got to the point where, you can only do so many things where the court's we'll give you more chances. And then there's a point where the court just says, enough is enough. We're sending you away. And that, I won't name what I did, but that's what happened. I got involved in too much, and I found myself in jail for 90 days up in Lindsay. And that was around the age of 21, 22. And, if there was something in my life, my dad and my family members and everybody that loved and cared about me, they all wanted me to do well. They all wanted me to change and turn my life around. But I didn't want to. I was still really in love with being miserable. I was really in love with just being in my shitty shit and being and I accepted that at some point along that journey. I accepted that this is what it's going to be like. This is my life now. Until I was sent to jail and was sent away for, I wouldn't say a lot of time, but 90 days feels like 90 years. So, and then we're going to bring it back to a remember when moment. I remember sitting in my cell, and there was a few fights broke out in a couple of cells down the block. And I remember kind of just, and I'm not a violent person, so being in an atmosphere where there's violence and there's, I'm in a jail cell with a convicted murderer. I mean, there's people down my block that are, rapists and convicted murderers and thieves, and it's pretty intense. And it started to really wake me up, and it started to really let me see just how, I wouldn't say how far gone I had become, but how far I'd strayed away from that person that I wanted to be when I was a kid. I wanted to be someone who was definitely not in jail. But I always had, especially with my mom being sick, I wanted to be a person that helped people. I wanted to be somebody that somebody could look up to and be like, man, it'd be really cool to have someone like that as my mentor, or have someone like that in my life. And I started to, and that was early on in my sentence when I started thinking like this. And I still had another 2.5 months to try to process this and try to see if there's a way to fix, or not fix, but at least right the course of my life. And when I got out, I I sought the help that I needed. I sought counseling, and it was still a struggle to get away from the drug life. At least I was in jail, and drugs are they flow through the jail system like no other system in the world. But
I was going to ask, was that 3 months detox time for you as well? Was that time for you to not only think about the choices you've made, the path you were on, but was that your first sort of kick at the can to day one of sobriety, or?
Yeah, if I wanted to when I was in jail, I had the access to it. That's never an issue in jail. It's never an issue to like go without whatever you need. There are always ways, and there's always ways. But for me, for the first couple of weeks, I was kind of like in a lockdown situation, just because of the violent crime that I had committed. I wasn't able to be in general population, so I was in what essentially they call the hole. So whether I wanted to or not, I was kind of isolated away from all of that. And so, yeah, it was almost a forced detox, if you want to say. But I came out of that. In the middle of my mid-sentence, he blurts out, "Have you ever thought about treatment?" And I'm like, "I'm doing that. I'm coming to see you. Like, this is treatment." And he's like, "No, like intense treatment, like institutionalized treatment for drugs and alcohol." And I immediately clammed up and was like, "Nope, not doing that." Although I was ready to make a change, I wasn't that ready to make a change because I was scared.
There was still that thing in the back of your head.
Absolutely. I was scared. I was terrified.
Yeah.
From like age 15 to where I'd be, I guess, 24, 25 at this time, that's like 11 years of doing one thing really well.
Yeah, we did it really well.
Really well. So to just have someone be like, "Well, this is what we're going to do, and I think this is what you should do," I just wasn't really ready to accept it. But I sat on it and I thought about it. And I remember coming back a couple weeks later and being like, "You know what? Like, what's the worst that is going to happen?" And at this point, I'd started to not lose family members, but I'd started to like see them really pull away. And for me, that was really hurt. That really hurt too, because I loved my family, and to see them kind of pull away just because of my selfless actions, that really started to affect me and really hurt. So I said yes, and I was like, "All right, if we're gonna do this, let's do it. But if we're gonna do it, we're gonna do it all the way. None of this sissing around, drop-in center stuff. We're gonna."
You're going in. Had you used, before you finish that, had you used between getting out of jail and going into treatment?
Yeah. I wasn't totally sober at all. I tried to definitely cut down, I guess, but I was still using, I was still drinking, and I was still getting involved with the police and getting involved with the law a little bit, but not to the certain point where they were like, "All right, we're sending you back." I was on probation, so I had to definitely adhere by certain rules, regulations. I would kind of stretch those regulations. I was working at the time, so I could kind of get away with certain things just being at work and working in the restaurant business. If I wanted to use, I could use at work, because in the
where we push the drinking under the rug in the restaurant business. And we provide discounted drinks for all of our employees at the end of
you're not allowed to drink, and you're only allowed to be at work. Well, good thing my work supplies alcohol,
Right.
But yeah, I was definitely still using it, definitely still drinking at the time, but I at least had to proactively try to cut down. But then, I was talking with Justin, and he was like, "Well, there's this great place up in Elliott Lake called Camilla Center, and it's a 6-7 week program." So I said, "Okay, might as well do it. Let's do it." And I wasn't fully wanting to do it, but I knew I had to. So they kind of break it down when you get there. You have 2 weeks of detox, you have 1 week of pre-treatment, and then you have 4 weeks of pretty intense treatment. And it's a live-in center, and you live there. And I don't know if anyone knows where Elliott Lake is, but that's kind of up north. So you're in the middle of nowhere. So if you're going there, you're going there. And my dad, he, God bless his soul, he came down to Kingston one day, and he packed my whole apartment up, put it in a van, brought it all home, and then 2 days later he drove me up and dropped me off. And I know that was like really hard for him. And on the way, I found out after I got out of treatment, I found out on the way there that my grandmother had passed, but they didn't want to tell me because they knew that I would not want to go. I would want to go to her funeral. I want to somewhat try to mourn that loss. And it was really hard on them, and he kind of regrets doing it, but he knew it was for the best, that I can't tell him, and we have to keep going with this plan in order to save his life. So I did the treatment. I did 2 weeks of detox. I did a week of pre-treatment where they kind of just prepare you what's going to happen. And then they have 4 weeks of intense treatment. And in that 4 weeks, the detox part wasn't too hard since, I'd been to the 90 days in jail, and I'd kind of done some counseling. So my body wasn't going to go crazy if I didn't have these things. But it was definitely hard. But the 4 weeks was very intense. And it wasn't, as I said earlier, it wasn't about just not drinking and using. It was about taking a look at the crap that you have been carrying around for 11 plus years. And how the hell do you start to deal with that? And how do you properly start to deal with that? So that's what that whole 4 weeks was about. It was an AA-based program, so they did walk you through the steps. Not all of them. You did 1 to 5 during the time that you were there. And I met a counselor there that really kind of just changed my life. And I still talk to her to this day. And I'm almost 8 years now. And every year, I talk to her probably about 4 times a year. And I'm the only client that she's ever had that has kept contact with her after the fact that they've left. But that was a life-changing place. And when I got out, I kind of just kept this mentality of let's trying to keep getting better. Let's try to improve things. Let's get your life together and let's make the most of it. So I just ran with that. I got back to Kingston, and then I moved to Brockville, and I started working, and people called me crazy, but I went right back into the restaurant industry.
It's like so many triggers. So yeah, my question is, how did you kind of jump right back into that?
My thinking around drugs and alcohol at the time had really changed. It had really changed in terms of why I used them and what the purpose of them was for. And my purpose wasn't in line with that anymore. My purpose was totally headed in the opposite direction. And maybe I am one of the lucky ones, but it just started as I saw my life getting better. I really started to see that these things that in my life, and they're still around, but they just didn't interest me. The way that my life has started being going and the good things that have started to come my way, that was way more appealing than ever going back to anything remotely like that lifestyle. So, and then as things in my life started to get better, my family started, those relationships, I worked at them. They just didn't get better, things just don't get better because I'm not in that lifestyle. And I mentioned this on when we were talking the other day, is I had all these great supports, but if I didn't do any work on myself and I didn't put the work in, then those supports were useless. So I really took it upon myself to use those supports and really dive into the lifestyle of recovery and make the most of it. And, you know, at a certain point of working and improving my life, we have another visitor.
I love this. Animal Planet.
Yeah. You know, I started to think maybe there's more to life than just being a good person. Maybe I can help somebody as well. And this program that me and you are in now, it's a fairly new program. It's only, I guess, 3 years old now.
Yeah, we're the third round.
Yeah. So, and I had friends in my AA groups that had taken this course and really liked it. And so I sat down with them, I talked to them, and I was like, what is this about? And they explained to me, and all of a sudden, like, it was just like, this is I don't know if I'm meant to do this, but this is something that I want to do. And if it's something that I want to do, I can make it work because I've made all these other good things in my life work. So, and then...
It's interesting, Jared, because I think that I believe everything you've been through to this point in your life serves a purpose in how you serve people moving forward, because I do believe you're here to help other people. You are an extreme success story to me. I feel like we both are, and I feel like it's really okay to stand back in that and feel proud about how far we've come. But you've been through everything you've been through to give you the experience you need for the impacts that you're already having on people, whether you see that or not. I feel that about you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. What do you see? Two questions for you, and we'll come back to this one, where you maybe see yourself going after the program. But as someone who comes from addiction, and myself as well, I'm no longer attached to the word addict. I don't walk into a room or a group setting or anything and I'm like, I'm Ashley, I have mental wellness issues, and I'm an addict. I'm Ashley. I used to really deal in a great abundance with those things, but I no longer consider myself to be that way because my mentality of thinking has also changed, and I feel like I've shed that version of myself. Do you see it that way, or do you still very much attach and relate to yourself as someone who has had addiction before?
Yeah. I mean, I think the great things about me and you being such close friends is that we can sometimes agree to disagree. Like, this is that definitely is that's your life, you know. For me personally, it's dangerous for me to stop thinking of myself as an addict. When I start thinking of myself as an addict or an alcoholic, I start to allow some things in my life that I know are not good for me. So for me, it is important to associate myself with the fact that, you know, I'm an addict and I'm an alcoholic. But, you know, that's not for everybody. There's definitely people that can, as you said, they feel they've shed that part of their life. And for them, that's really good, and it makes them better, and it opens a lot of open doors for them. For me personally, it's just that part of my life where, and it's a part of my remember when, it's like, yeah, you're an addict, and if you start to think differently, then there's a possibility that you can end up in that same place again.
And I understand that so wholeheartedly, and I think I know the addictive personality that it is that I have, whether it's with drugs and alcohol, fitness, nutrition, all of those things. Yep. I recognize my addictive personality. And I don't want to, and let me clarify that, in letting go of the label of an addict in my life, and just letting go of all labels in my life, it doesn't mean that I don't have that internal warning system that lets me know, right, girl, you still have this thing. I think I just choose to let go of the labels that we put on people as well. But it is always still there. And actually it was said to me, I have a friend of mine, a very important friend of mine, who the other day was offered a drink. And she said, no, I don't want one. And the question to her immediately after was, well, when did you quit drinking? And she said, I didn't quit drinking. I just don't drink. And it was like this brilliant moment of I connected with that and was like, oh, you don't have to keep counting the days anymore. You don't have to keep counting the time. You can just be someone who chooses to not do that. And it was just such a beautiful way of hearing someone explain they're not drinking. Because also, do you find that when you tell people you don't drink or you don't do things, they immediately ask why?
Oh, that's, yeah.
Yeah, and then what's your answer to that? You know, because then it first off, to anyone out there who wants to ask a question, it doesn't matter why someone's not drinking.
Yeah, and you know, at the start, I guess in like my first year when I was, you know, hanging out with people and they'd be like, "Do you want to drink?" And they'd be like, "I'm like, no." They'd be like, "Why?" I'd be like, "Because I'm an alcoholic and I'm an addict and I can't have a drink." And now, like, and now I'm at that point where I'm like, man, this is none of your fucking business. Like, if I don't want to drink, you don't have the right to ask me.
Yeah.
If I want to, then, you know, which I don't. But it's none of their business. So when people now ask me, they're like, oh, like, and for the most part, like, I've gained so many friends and a good circle of people in my life that already know that. So the fact that I don't really even find myself in situations where people are going to ask me that, but it still happens. What I tell them, I don't remember the last time I was asked that question. I've assumed that if someone asked me now, I'd just be like, no, thanks, I'm good. But I still feel that pressure sometimes, you know, and especially when going out with people, if you know they drink or, you know, they have the joint or they smoke a joint or whatever, you know, it doesn't bother me. New people, they'll ask me like, hey, do you want to smoke this joint? I'd be like, no, I'm good. I almost, and it's almost how I say it too, that they're like, oh, okay, well, I'm just not going to push that subject anymore. So I think a lot of it is how I deliver my answer too. But that's kind of my mentality about it this nowadays is like, man, if you need to ask, then like, you know, you're probably not a person I want to be hanging around with in the first place.
Fair. That's fair. I like that answer. I also think that we're coming maybe into a new wave in society where it doesn't really matter one way or the other, and we just need to kind of just let it be, which is really great. We don't all need to run to substance for some reason or another. So circling back to when you finish mental wellness and addiction, is there something that is pulling you in a certain direction, or is there a place you see yourself wanting to be, a certain demographic of person or human you want to work with, or do you don't really know still at this point?
I mean, I have a couple ideas as to what I think I kind of want to do, and some of it's not even really involved with drugs and alcohol or mental wellness. I have a really big interest because I went through the jail system to maybe look at a career in being a counselor within the jails. And there's been a big movement in trying to instill these kind of programs into jails where inmates have a way and a place to go and someone to talk to in such a place where it's jail is sometimes the last place you want to just lay your emotions out and try to be raw and try to be vulnerable because it's seen as a sign of weakness, and a place like that can be taken advantage of. So I think there's some part of me that kind of wants to get involved with the jail system. There's also a big part of me that wants to be involved with detox centers and working within those places. And because when you go to detox, most of the time you're pretty low. You're at a bad point in your life. And detox is not a hotel. It's not a place where you just go to be on vacation. It's a hard place to go, and it can be a really scary place to go. And someone who's experienced detox places, I often saw a lack of human connection in those places. You know, they had a job to do. They made sure they did it. They kept you safe, and that was it. But I think there's room to grow within that industry, and I think there's room to grow in terms of yeah, we can provide a place for you, but we can also maybe try to provide something else for you. And that is maybe something you haven't felt in a long time. Is just a human connection and someone to listen. So those are two big things that I kind of want to maybe look into. And I'm also native as well. And so is my brother. And like and my dad exposed, some of that culture to us growing up. And as we all know, there's a lot of Native communities and Aboriginal communities that are suffering and don't have resources and don't have places to go and don't have people to talk to in terms of these issues around addiction, mental health. So maybe there is a place in those communities for someone that has gone through what I've gone through, and come out on the good side of life, to go back and try to, I don't want to say try to make a change the world, but maybe there's a small part that I can do. And I think even doing a small part is something that should be applauded.
I think that I'd like to correct you on that statement, because the small piece that you're playing is changing the world. And the ripple effect that you have, the inspiration you just have simply in my life and the way that I spread that, your ripple effect is already taking its magic out. And that's why I say I'm so lucky not only to have you in my life, I also feel blessed that you've been through what you've been through so that you can bring into my life what you've brought, and that you get to continue to bring that into other people's lives, because you are in every capacity such a gift, and your story is a gift, and what you have to say is just, it has so much meaning. I love the person you are. Every life research you go on making, I hope I get to stand beside you and watch that happen, because I don't know if you even realize the impact that you have already. It's pretty wild.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Before I kind of sign off on this with you, what is one of the big pieces, what is a piece of advice you could give to someone right now in this situation who is maybe looking down the barrel of addiction and feeling very alone, or looking down the barrel of that mental health issue and feeling really alone? What is something that you can offer them right now in this moment?
You asked me that question the other day, and then after our talk, I sat back and I thought about that. And I also wanted to add on to that, but a big part of my story and a big part of how I got to where I am, I would say is, take a chance. For me, it was 11 years of just not believing that there was something better. And for me, the biggest thing was I took a chance on something so unfamiliar to me. And I think, it's hard when you're in that moment and you're looking down at the barrel, as you said, and literally some people are looking down the barrel. Some people are really at that point where they have nowhere to go, and they feel that they have no option. I think the good thing about our day and age is that there's lots of resources, and even through what we're going through with this pandemic, there's still lots of resources, and there's still lots of places to go, and there's lots of people. I think my biggest thing was say, like, don't be afraid to take a chance on yourself, because whoever you are and wherever you are and whatever you're going through, you are worth it. But take a chance on yourself to prove that to yourself.
I think that's brilliant. And you're looking at two examples of that. You're looking at two examples of people who really felt in that place, who I can say that moment of being alone, you've pushed and lost everything in your life completely. And 3 years ago, I wouldn't have thought after my relapse that I would be here. I wouldn't think I would know the people that I know and have the opportunities to do the work that I have to do. So I think that's amazing. It is. It's take a chance. It's just actually give yourself that moment. So that's, Jared, I'm just, again, so grateful to you. I look forward to every opportunity we have to land together. I am going to be circling back around with Soul Sense, the talk show, and coming at you for a cooking segment soon. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do some work through that as well. Thank you so much for existing.
You're welcome. Wow, for existing. Wow.
Yeah.
That is great. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for having me. This has been a great weekend in terms of just conversing with you and you know, and it's been beneficial for me too, to sometimes talk about these things. And I think, you know, if people are seeing this and people are watching this, then, you know, maybe you're right. There's a lot of good things that can come from these conversations and not being afraid to have these conversations. So.
Yeah, these ugly, scary conversations. I'm just going to keep having them and jumping in and pulling people in with me. So that'll be a thing. Thank you so much. We will we'll talk soon.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.